welcome everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar tonight with Kristin, Joivell, and myself. We're really excited to talk to you a bit more about school gardens and thinking about integrating them into your classroom and communities. And so we're going to start off with having Kristin share more about her own background doing this at her school in Pennsylvania and how that's gone, some of the challenges and where it's at now. Then I'll kind of take a broader step back in terms of giving you some tips and tools based on where you are. And then we're really excited to have a special announcement at the end. So without further ado, we'll let Kristin get started telling you all her story.
That's me, the storyteller. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see my PowerPoint, and I'll be referring to some of the handouts that you received through the email here also during the PowerPoint. You can look at those like too as I'm presenting too. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen so you can see the PowerPoint now. Okay, you should all be able to see that. Can everyone see that?
All good.
Okay, good. All right. Well, great. So I'm kind of going to tell you about the school gardens here at my elementary school, Juniata Valley Elementary School. We're in South Central Pennsylvania. I always tell everybody we're near kind of Penn State main campus. So if you know Penn State football, you kind of have an idea of where we are in Pennsylvania. We're also near the Raystown Lake region. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Our school is a very rural elementary school. The elementary school has about 400 kids, and our middle and high school is right across the parking lot, and they have about 600 kids or so. And that's actually our whole school district. So we're a very small rural school district. So, you know, we have a lot of access to the outdoors and a lot of access to outdoor spaces and garden spaces. But that's okay if you don't. It's okay if you just have a window in your classroom in an urban setting, because I'm going to talk about all kinds of things you can do with gardens and growing them at your schools no matter where you're at. So like I said, we're very lucky to have lots of outdoor space at Juniata Valley. And, you know, naturally when I started teaching, I saw this as a wonderful place to create opportunities for growth outdoors. You know, we have a forested area that you can kind of see here. We're sitting in the middle of it. We have a field also near our school, and we have a river on our school campus. So we have lots of great outdoor resources at Juniata Valley. We're very lucky to have access to all of that. So I like to use these spaces to create opportunities for growth for the kids outdoors. You know, taking children outdoors is something I do all the time. You know, even if you just have a little piece of lawn in front of your school next to a sidewalk, that's still considered outdoors. You don't have to have the giant mountains and fields and forests here like we have at our school. You know, but taking children outdoors can be a really essential part of your day and an essential part of their learning at your school. You know, if you're still not sold on taking children outdoors, or maybe you've never done it before, or maybe you're wondering why, here's a couple books by Richard Louv. And then at the bottom, there's a link to a video about his Last Child in the Woods book. And I find it a really great video to kind of show to new teachers and to my student teachers about why it is important to take children outside, especially in this digital day and age with kind of a disconnect with the outdoors. And if you'd like to learn more about that type of thing, there's a couple coalitions and networks that you can look at and that you can join and find out opportunities for more expansion on that idea. So when do you start? Like, when can you start taking children outside? I say start tomorrow if you have school. Now we've got about 12 inches of snow right now here in Pennsylvania, so we might not have a full day of school tomorrow. So I don't know if I'll get mine outside tomorrow. But I suggest taking children outdoors as soon as you can during the school year. How to start? You know, a lot of science, how it starts at our schools, we kind of start from open exploration and from what we know. So you can see here in the picture, you know, I'm just doing an open exploration nature collage with some children. You could see on the bottom of the screen there, differentiated science inquiry, which is an NSTA store product, so National Science Teachers Association product. I highly recommend this book. All of the science lessons I write for my school curriculum, I write based on this type of science inquiry. So I do recommend this. If you're not a science teacher primarily, or maybe you don't have much of a science curriculum, or maybe you're a new teacher, I highly recommend maybe starting with those Richard Louv books and maybe this book to try to figure out what kinds of lessons you could teach to get children's outdoors. not just for gardens, but for other science lessons outdoors too. You know, and maybe you already have a science curriculum at your school, or maybe you're at an environmental center where you have a goal already, and maybe you're not starting from square one. So if you have science units in your curriculum already, you know, maybe that's the place where you might want to start with thinking of taking children outside and doing gardening projects with them. For example, you know, parts of a plant is something that I teach. So we went into our nature center and investigated different kinds of plants, took some samples, and then from there we divided those plants into their parts. So how else can you create opportunities for growth indoors? You know, maybe you don't have an outdoor area, but maybe you have a window that you're getting some sunlight through. Now the windows in my classroom, they have louvered blinds inside of the 2 window panes, so there's no way to get rid of the blinds. So we have really limited sunlight in our classroom, especially the way that the earth is moving and the sun shines through those blinds. It really restricts the sunlight. So you can see I do have a window garden. This was an older one I had a long time ago, before I had some other resources in my classroom. So you can see here we planted a crop and harvested, I call it the limited crop, because of the restriction of the light. We didn't have much of a spinach crop here. So as the sun is moving across the sky, I had to keep moving the garden around to follow the sunlight track on the floor of our classroom. So that was how I used to do gardening in our indoor garden, and it was really hard. So I thought back then, you know, maybe I can do a different project that doesn't require as much sunlight and as much moving furniture around. So I did designing moss gardens, which is another really cool project you can do with students. Just some simple gardens that you can do inside, just taking some moss samples and having the children arrange them in an interesting way. And then we have made maps and things to the garden, so that we involve some math concepts also and social studies concepts in this project. But moss gardens are great because they don't require that much sunlight compared to, say, spinach and raising a crop. So they were a great alternative with those louvered blinds in our classroom. So if you have a lot of limited sunlight, maybe this is something you'd be interested in trying out as a simplistic indoor garden project. You can do window herb gardens. Herbs are pretty easy to grow and to get started. I was the Fuel Up to Play 60 coordinator for our school district for 6 years. So as part of that project, and the link is at the bottom of the screen if you're interested in seeing more about that national program, it's the National Football Association and the Dairy Council kind of come together to make this big program for schools to teach health and keeping kids active. So if you're interested in that, there's the link. But as part of that project, when I was the coordinator for that for our district, we did window herb gardens also. So I had families come to school for an activity night, and we reused milk cartons from our cafeteria and prepared them. And then we got them taped together and built them. And then, of course, added the soil to them and planted the seeds in them. And you can see all the labels with the cups of seeds there. So the parents and children had the chance to plant 7 different types of herbs and take some home. And then the classrooms that participated, we did them in those classrooms too. And then through that, I tried to develop an awareness of herbs and how herbs are used in food and in cooking. And many of the children had never smelled herbs on their own before. But it was interesting because as we were doing it, a lot of them were talking about how it smelled like the local pizza place, Pisano's. And of course, we were using things like oregano and basil and things. So it was good that they were making that connection to foods that they were aware of already. And then we do have outdoor gardens at our school, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So then as part of this, I tried to connect that to the outdoor gardens. Like, where do these herbs come from? Where did the chives come from? Where does basil come from? What does oregano look like? And so you can see the rosemary and chives and basil in the background there in these outdoor gardens. And I have things labeled for the children to make that connection. So we were smelling the herbs inside from the dried out herbs, and then, you know, going outside and seeing the herbs where they're growing. So, you know, the indoor gardens are great, but like I said, with limited sunlight, it's very difficult to get things to grow, especially if they require a lot of sunlight. So I wrote a grant through Donors Choose, and there's a handout that I sent you on Donors Choose that tells you how to do that. The link at the bottom of this page tells you specifically about my garden project and my grant that I wrote for Donors Choose. So it was actually funded in 4 days, and the indoor garden, you can see as it arrived, we were very excited to open it up. And of course, we had these packaging peanuts all over our classroom and had to vacuum them up, and it took a couple days because they were static electricity to everything in the classroom. So that was a lot of fun too. But but it's a really great opportunity for growth indoors. because with the indoor garden, it comes with a grow light. So now the problem with moving furniture around to follow the track of the sun was not an issue anymore. So for now, we prepared the plots for this project. And again, now we can transport the plots inside after planting the things outside, and then observe the growth as the plants are growing. And here we were growing lettuce and spinach. And you can see all the kids' great observations, making really great observations about some of the plants having leaves that are 3 leaves. Some are smaller than their fingers. Some are bigger, some are still small. And then, of course, the great science pictures that they're growing, which actually are pretty accurate, looking at the gardens and looking how the plants look. And then, of course, harvesting the food when it's ready. You can see here we got better growth. This is lettuce. This is the lettuce part of the garden. So you can see, you know, we got much better growth than with the limited sunlight. And then, of course, eating the food is always the best part for some of the students. You know, you'd think kindergarten students, they probably won't eat spinach and lettuce, but every year that I do this, the whole garden is eaten and gone. So it's really excellent. We're growing our spinach right now. We just started it a couple weeks ago for this school year, and I already have a few kids who, you know, I don't eat spinach. I said, okay, well, we'll see when it's harvest day. We'll see what happens. And, you know, at least every kid tries it. And because we harvest so early and so young with the spinach, I think a lot of them are expecting the bitter spinach taste, and then when they taste the young baby spinach, it's a new food for them, even though they've had spinach before. And then, of course, documenting the experience is really important, you know, trying to tie in the curriculum with reading and writing into our science work. You can see here we're just doing simplistic sentence frames about eating the food that we grew in our garden. But of course, depending on what grade level or what students you work with, you can expand that as far or as little as you need to, you know, depending on how much time you have or how much curriculum you need to cover with your standards. So one thing that I'm excited about is composting lessons. And at the bottom is a link to the composter that I use in my classroom. It's called the Worm Factory 360. It's actually donated to me by my friend was killed in a military accident about 6 or 7 years ago. And he was a very environmental-minded student at Penn State campus, Altoona. And his mom donated the Worm Factory 360 to my classroom. And I think he would be really happy that that is in my classroom composting because he was very environmentally conscious. So it's really exciting that I have this thing because with the composting lessons, I can connect the indoors and the outdoors. On the handouts that you were sent, I sent you 4 of my composting lessons, all designed based on that book, the Differentiated Science Inquiry book that I told you about earlier. So, you know, you might want to take a look at those if you're interested in that type of lesson and how you might write a lesson like that up. Each of the lessons has one big question that we cover for the lesson. I have one in there for you, what's inside the compost bin, just basically an open exploration of what is inside this thing. Looking closer at compost, so looking at the components of compost. Who's recycling what by starting to look at what's going on specifically in this compost bin. And then the project that you're seeing here is turning old food scraps into compost, which is what we're doing right now in my classroom. And then I also included just a simple compost journal with you just to kind of show you what that might look like in a younger grade level classroom. So you can see here, you know, exploring the compost is always exciting, you know, taking a look in the already started compost bin to see what's happening in there. And this is just a comparison of some foods we had before composting. And then after composting, we dug them out and tried to find those foods again. You can see we found some of the grape stems, and we found some of the strawberry tops, and some of the lettuce didn't really compost very well because it was mostly on the top, but our banana peels were almost gone. And then with the compost, we add it to our outdoor gardens, which, like I said, I'll tell you more about those later. So eventually with the compost that we have right now, we'll be adding that to our outdoor gardens as well. So connecting that compost with the outdoors is great. But, you know, even if you don't have that outdoor space, you know, you can be composting in your classroom and then putting that compost into pots or into containers and using that for soil in your classroom to make that connection. Like I said, it isn't always about having beautiful outdoor spaces to garden in. This type of thing can be done indoors as well. So we're very lucky, like I said, we have an outdoor garden space at Juniata Valley. And you can see here, you know, we have a beautiful raised garden bed on the left. We also have a beautiful raised garden bed on the right, which you can't see in this picture, but it's exactly the same. And then further down near the silver flagpole to the left, we have a flower area with some sunflowers. And to the right of that, behind the giant tomato plants, you can't see it either, but it's right next to the parking lot, we have a mint garden as well. So we have a lot of great outdoor space for our outdoor garden lessons. And you can see it's really nicely landscaped. We have some great benches that were made by a local company with some etching on it in memory of some bus drivers and coaches that have passed away in our district. And it looks really beautiful. We have a great patio there with flagstones where people can relax and hang out near our gardens. And here's where I want to mention one of my partners at Juniata Valley. Her name is Pam Garugan, and she's our sustainability club advisor at the high school. And her and I do a lot of projects together. And she really is the main person that cares for our gardens in conjunction with our custodial staff. And, you know, we really partner with a lot of cool projects, but she's really the person who's kind of in charge of these outdoor gardens and their upkeep. So I just want to mention her and, you know, her main role in conducting all of this garden maintenance over the years. You know, and finding a partner at your school to work with is really important. You know, a lot of these projects take a lot of time and take a lot of after school hours. So if you can find a parent or a garden club or someone who's interested in joining you, you know, it can really help out with the workload. So we were lucky enough to receive a garden grant to build those raised garden beds. On the right is Pam Garugan, so you can see my partner from the high school, one of our parent volunteers, and I actually had her son in kindergarten, so it's pretty cool that I get to work with her on all these projects. So we received money to build those raised garden beds a few years ago. And we were really excited to celebrate our new garden. So we had a lot of our students and science club participants celebrate the new garden with a special celebration at our high school after we received it. And then, you know, the thing is, okay, so now we have this raised garden bed. How do we invite participation by teachers and students at our elementary school and at our high school? So Mrs. Garugan designed these garden menagerie animals, and she developed some lessons where children could come to her lessons with the garden menagerie, going out and seeing and creating an awareness of the herbs. So here we have Tilly the turtle in the thyme, and the previous one was Sally the sake in the cilantro. And she had a lot of these neat clay sculptures created by the high school students to help introduce herbs to the students in the garden. And then also Pam and I designed some teacher-selected lessons for fall and winter and spring. And I had sent you 3 handouts there for fall, winter, and spring teacher-selected lessons. And you can see here, this is our mint garden on the left here that the kids are looking at. This was the lesson about making mint tea. So that was one of our fall lessons that we listed that were available to try to help teachers find some lessons that they could do out in the gardens. And then this is one of the teacher-selected lessons for winter. So this is a lesson called Let's Rock This Garden, and that's on your handout as well. And what this is collecting rocks from the natural area behind our school and then developing them into a rock sculpture in the garden to keep it looking nice for winter. Because winter is always a hard time for the garden, you know, especially it being right in front of our school. It has to kind of look nice all year long. So we want something going on in the garden during all 4 seasons of the year. So this is a way that we try to keep the garden looking interesting in winter. And then, of course, spring and the beginning of summer, of course, is a wonderful time for the garden because it always looks so nice. There's a teacher-selected lesson for spring, just a simplistic color scavenger hunt that I do with my students. And you can see, you know, just glancing at the picture, there's 5 or 6 colors already right there in this picture. This is just a small part of the garden. So another thing that's great to create opportunities for family learning is, you know, family garden events. You know, not just having the kids during the school day or me with my kids at my after-school science club do opportunities and activities in the garden, but inviting families in too to create that awareness of the garden and the awareness of, you know, the importance of gardening and outdoor activity for families too. So one thing I did, and you can see my sign in the background there, that this is an ongoing international science research site, and I'll talk more about our ongoing international science research a little later. But the process of making pesto, because I grew so much basil through this project, was something that I did with families. So I had families come to school for a basil pesto production night, and you can see this was the production line station called leaf removal. So here the children are, and parents are removing leaves from all the basil plants. And then here's the processing of the leaves in food processors, where parents were assisting their children with processing the leaves. And then here's the food processing station, where we're adding ingredients to the crushed basil leaves. And then after all the processing, we had a family pasta night to eat the pesto. So you can see families coming in. We have pasta in heaters there. We have some red sauce, and then the giant yellow bowl on the end is some of the pesto that we created. So you can see there's tons of it there. Many of the children hadn't ever eaten pesto before, so it was really exciting to see the reaction and how much some of them really enjoyed it. And just that awareness of, there's foods out there maybe you haven't tried yet that can be made with things from our garden. What's really great about the pasta is that the high school students in our life skills classroom are the students who cooked all the pasta for us to get it ready for that night's event. So that was another great way to involve more students with the project. Another thing that you can do to involve families, maybe you don't have access to all these kitchen utensils and resources that way. You can always do family field trips. Field trips maybe don't have to take place during the school day. Maybe your school doesn't have funding for that, or maybe your school doesn't have busing for that. So you can do evening field trips for families. At the bottom is a link to Giant grocery stores, and they provide what they call a Healthy Kids field trip. And I did mine as a family field trip. So I had families bring their children to the grocery store, and we all did the field trip together. And we did kind of a scavenger hunt in the grocery store to talk about healthy foods and where these foods come from. You see the student is kind of perusing the grapefruit and where that's coming from. And that's kind of what we were looking at on this field trip as families. And then, we talked about winter and how the winter garden can be a hard thing to make it look nice. Of course, summer is another hard time. Teachers were not there every single day in the summer. So we need to have summer garden stewards to care for the garden in the summer, especially with our raised garden beds. We have to be watering it, especially if there's not much rain during certain parts of the summer. So Mrs. Grugan arranges for there to be summer garden stewards for our garden weekly during the summer when the teachers are off. So another thing that is really important is having children act as citizen scientists. And I'll talk a little more about a resource for that later. But at the bottom is a link to the iTex project, which is the International Tundra Experiment. And you can see that plastic thing on the left is part of the international research we're doing at my school with climate change, looking at a warmed plot and looking at an unwarmed plot and the changes with the phenophases in the plants in each of those plots. And you're probably wondering, what is she talking about? Phenophases, what are they? Phenophases, if you're not familiar, these are the life stages in a plant depending on seasonal changes, kind of in a nutshell. That's kind of what phenophases are. At the bottom are links to 3 really great videos I use in my classroom, I use with parents to kind of show you what phenophases are and kind of some of the deeper meaning behind that. So feel free to click on those and watch those. They're really interesting, and I think they really give you a good idea about the science behind all of that. Identifying phenophases. I taught the kindergarten students how to do that. So here we're kind of looking at some blooming and budding and wilting phenophases. A great resource for that is in your handouts. It's called the Botany Primer. And it's a really great, I think it's 67 pages long, but it's a really great resource, to kind of give you the idea of how that works and how you can document that at your school. And it doesn't have to just be with plants you're growing, it can be with trees. So maybe you don't have room for a garden space, or maybe you're just gardening indoors. You can look at phenophases of trees too. Now, of course, they're a lot slower than the crocuses and tulips here in our garden that we were looking at. But trees are great to look at for phenophases too, especially if you only have, one tree in your courtyard. You can really be documenting what's going on with that tree and the date that it blooms and the date that the first leaf out happens and the date that the leaves change color. So that might be something you might want to look at. And then comparing the phenophases, we did the warmed and unwarmed plot comparisons. So you can see the difference in the warmed and unwarmed plot, with a lot of the ones in the warmed plot on the same date blooming, and a lot of the ones in the unwarmed plot on the same date, not quite in full bloom yet. And documenting the phenophases, of course, is important. Of course, we documented them through photography, but I wanted to show the kindergarten students how you can document science through graphs and maps and things like this too. So in your handouts, I gave you a plant phenology journal, and it kind of shows you how we did that. What you can see there in the center, that was the tulip bulbs, and what we were seeing there with the B's would be budding, and O would be open. And then the 6 small circles around the central circle, those are where the crocus plants, the crocus bulbs are planted, and you can see the kids indicating O for open, W for wilting, and a couple B's still for budding. So you can see, the differences in the 2 different plots. And of course, the temperature is interesting too, the temperature difference. So you can see here we have a digital thermometer that we can use to measure temperature. And then I also have regular thermometers stuck in the ground too, to document the temperature that way. So sharing all this data with scientists can be really important, especially as citizen scientists, because there's just so much data to collect, but not enough scientists to collect all this data in all these different areas. So I was very lucky to be able to go to Greenland last summer and to help out with some projects that Dr. Eric Post from UC Davis is doing through the Apples Project. And the Apples Project is Arctic plant phenology through engaged science. It's a project through, like I said, UC Davis and Penn State University. So I was lucky to be involved with that. So this school year, I kind of extended that project to a crop production project to explore crop production. And here I am at a family reading night, actually, where they were studying Tommy de Pala books. And I'm talking about, basil, again, and pesto. And they were reading books about spaghetti and things with stregonona. So I thought it would be a good connection to reading that could be done at the family reading night. And again, I'm going to be having my students present that at our science fair this year and feeding pesto to everyone. So I can finally finish up all this pesto I have in my freezer and feed it to everyone. So how did we get all this basil grown for our pesto? So we started them in the classroom in 2017. And then we monitored the basil in our classroom in our indoor garden. And then we tasted the young basil with last year's kindergarten kids so that they'd have a chance to experience the taste of it. We made mini pizzas and put the basil on there. And then all summer long, I took photographs to compare the plots, again, with the warmed and unwarmed plot, like you saw with the tulip and crocus bulbs. You can see the differences there on the same date with growth. It's really apparent with the basil, maybe more so than with the crocuses and tulips. And then with this year's kindergartners, I helped them learn again with phenophases, determining time for harvest. Because with the basil plants, part of the project was that I wanted to only harvest when the basil plants were in the flowering phenophase. So if it isn't flowering, I wouldn't harvest it. So you can see here the girl trying to find the flowering ones. So those are the ones that we can actually snip with the scissors and start harvesting. And so then after we harvested and picked all the leaves off, we weighed them in our district office on the postal scale. And then what was cool is last year's kindergartners, I invited them down to my classroom to share the harvest now that it's been made into pesto with this year's kindergartners. So we have 2 school years of kids joining in on a project, collaborating. And, that's something that maybe you'll be interested in doing at your school. Maybe there's another teacher interested in collaboration with these types of projects that maybe you can team up with. So one thing that I want to start working on for this school year is expanding on our school-wide garden lessons so that there is more participation with all of the children in our school district. You heard me talk about my students and my science club and Mrs. Grugan, the high school sustainability club students. And those are probably the main participants in the garden lessons. And as you can see here, this is a school-wide garden lesson. Pam Grugan designs this giant garden gathering at the beginning of the school year each year, where we talk about health of the community, health of the planet, and health of the person. And here I'm talking about health of the planet because I'm talking about recycling. And we incorporate that into our garden gathering as well. And you can see all the children from the elementary school are gathered in the lawn outside our elementary school at the end of the day to learn about gardens and health together. And what we want to do at my school is we'd like to develop some garden lesson plans so that every child in the elementary school can come to an actual garden lesson where they do something in the garden, the outdoor gardens. So that's our future goal. And through what Lucy and I would like to present to you, the National School Garden Project for Earthwatch alumni, that's how I'd like to get started on, creating opportunities for shared learning among you guys and among all of the students at my elementary school. And so I had one other handout for you about sharing data with scientists, about how your students can be citizen scientists. And there's about 10 citizen science opportunities on that handout that you can take a look at. That maybe that's the way maybe you want to get started into gardening at your school. So I think that's all I have about my story and the story of our gardens at our school. And I guess if anybody had any questions about that, I could answer some of those at the end maybe. And I'd like to turn it over to Lucy so that she can tell you a little bit more about, how you can get started with all of this. I mean, I talked about a lot of things that I've done, but I mean, maybe one of the things that Lucy can expand on is how to get started with all these things at your school.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristin. So like what Kristin said, we are going to leave some time at the end for questions. feel free, if you don't want to forget it, to write it in the chat box now, and then we'll get to it at the end if you have anything specific for Kristin. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to go into my presentation, and then we'll take some time at the end to explain this big project idea we have and answer questions. Let me just share my screen with you all. One moment. Great. So as Kristin said, I'm going to talk a bit about connecting school gardens to curriculum and how to think about this more broadly. You can sort of think about her story and start finding ways to connect it to your own school and community based on your own resources and capabilities. So before I get started, I thought these few images were great just to give you the sense of how many different ways you can go about doing this. As you remember, Kristin said at the beginning of her presentation, she had that one little thing of herbs in her window without much natural light coming in, and that was years ago, and now she's built out all of these different outdoor gardens and other projects as well. So just kind of thinking about if it seems overwhelming to start multiple raised beds at your school, you don't need to start there. You can start pretty simple. Having some herbs like that photo on the left is a lot easier to manage at the beginning. But like I said, we're just going to take a step back and think about these different ways that you can make it happen. So getting started, one of the most important pieces as you're thinking about doing this yourself would be building a support network within your school and community. So throughout Kristin's presentation, she referenced lots of different people, whether it was parents or the garden coordinator, that played key roles in helping support her, and those are really important people to have involved. Getting buy-in from the parents, sometimes they can become your garden coordinator, which is really great. For your school administrators, needing their help both logistically, if you want to be having this happen during class time, getting that type of approval, or after school activities. They can definitely help with fundraising, depending on your school district. Other teachers at your school, having them also start finding ways to integrate it into their classroom, as well as just the maintenance of gardens as you're building a bigger garden. Having that maintenance support is really key. Local farmers is another way that you could potentially get support, having them donate seeds or come into your school and help teach you how to do it if you don't have too much experience gardening yourself. And different volunteers, AmeriCorps and Food Corps are two good examples where they have different programs around the country where they're supporting schools initiatives such as gardens. So looking into what's in your area, and also just other local organizations. That could be even if there's a garden shop nearby and seeing if they have soil or plants that they're looking to get rid of and donating those for free, or other types of support as well. So your pitch in terms of getting your school and maybe parents and others on board. So this photo is an image I took from a City Sprouts workshop here in Boston in December. And so City Sprouts is this great nonprofit located in Cambridge, Mass, where they pair with Cambridge and Boston public schools, and they help design and build a garden at the schools and then work one-on-one with teachers to build curriculum. So there are other organizations like this around the U.S. So again, a great thing to look into to see if there's something like City Sprouts in your town or city that's able to support you in this process. So I really liked this image that I saw at one of their locations where it has these three circles of STEM engagement, healthy choices, and social emotional growth. So looking at this as really sort of a holistic approach of the impact it can have on students. In terms of the healthy choices, it's learning about where their food's coming from. A great story they told was pulling a carrot out of the ground and an elementary school student not understanding why it had dirt on it. So just making those connections and understanding where their food's coming from. As Kristin gave it examples with the basil and making it into pesto, seeing how you can actually take something you're growing and turn it into food you eat and enjoy for the most part. As well as in healthy choices, just getting outside, having the kids move around a bit, not necessarily being on technology for a little bit. It goes back to Earthwatch's model of experiential learning. And that links to the STEM engagement of just asking questions, working through problems. A lot of this actually links towards some of the NGSS requirements, which I'll get into a little bit more later. But really having your students understand those things. Another piece that I found interesting in more of the STEM engagement is the idea of engineering and design. So having your students potentially involved in that part of the process, especially if you're with maybe middle school or definitely high school students. It's a great way thinking about how to lay out the garden, looking at geometry shapes with raised beds, or getting creative with design if you're working inside your classroom. And like Kristin had the issue with the natural light coming in, thinking about those different things and having those older students maybe be involved in that part of the process as well. And then finally, the social and emotional growth piece. It's a great chance for collaboration, working on communication around different students, reflecting on what's going on and what they're learning, as well as just understanding different cultures. Again, I'll get to this in a later slide, but there's a lot of opportunity to talk about what different foods are students cooking at home, especially if you have a diverse population in your school. Learning more about different spices and herbs and that sort of thing through this process. So that's definitely a piece as well. So thinking about just some of the basic tools you need to be aware of as you're getting this started. So of course, the finances are a big piece of this as you're looking to grow a bigger operation at your school. So budgeting out what you need to get started. Again, starting small is totally fine and actually encouraged if you don't have much of a budget, but adapting it based on different fundraising efforts you have. Another piece is technology. Kristin mentioned this a bit, and we'll send the handouts out to you after this, but I have iNaturalist in here as one example. Nature's Notebook is great for phenology walks with students. There's a lot of technology out there to become citizen science around observing your local area. And iNaturalist, if you're working in a garden, you can take photos of different insects that are in the garden. There's lots of ways to use these apps that are free and helping support scientist research through data collection as a piece of this as well. And outreach, again, reaching out to local companies and organizations, seeing if you can get things donated or support that way. Upcycling materials. A lot of school gardens are made through old plastic bins, or you can see in the bottom right here, those soda bottles are being used. So there's lots of different materials that you can reuse for the gardens in different ways. Even potentially propagating some plants so you're not having to buy too many plants to get started. But making a plan is really key before you just jump into it, planning out at least the basics of what you're going to need and getting creative, like that photo in the bottom right with your different tools is great. So some other things to consider. Kristin definitely went over these as well, but there are some sort of big pieces that you want to think about before you dive into this. So managing your own schedule, thinking about, is this going to happen during the school day as part of your classes? Is that something you can take on in addition to your normal workload? Or is it happening after school? And do you have time in your personal schedule for that? Winter and summer plans. Kristin figured out ways to have their gardens still go through the winter and summer with lesson plans and upkeep and all of that. What would you do during those time periods that aren't necessarily thriving in the winter and you might not be around in the summer? Student involvement, is this just for your class? Are you looking to get your whole school involved? And again, sort of when is that going to happen? Is that going to fall into your class periods or an additional time? And a produce plan. So if you're producing all these herbs in your classroom, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to turn the basil into pesto, or what are you going to do with those, send them home with the students? So thinking about that. And again, that's a great way to get creative and use that as part of the lesson plan, whether it's turning it into food or something else. So there's a lot on the slide, but I just wanted to touch on this. And again, we're going to follow up with handouts, so this will be on there as well. I highlighted a few in red that I was going to focus on a bit more tonight, and then happy to follow up with questions or talk later as you're thinking about grants. But of course, this is one really great way to get funding to start making this happen. The funding period can be sort of long, so in terms of getting a grant, So if this is something you're really eager to do, maybe in the fall, start small with that earth garden in your classroom and apply for grants thinking about a year out. A few of these grants that I'm going to talk about, I do know have all closed for this year, but will open again in the fall to apply for the following year. So the few I'm going to highlight are First Donors Choose. So that's what Kristin used that she mentioned. And that's a really great resource for teachers. I'm sure you're all, or most of you are aware of that already. It's pretty easy. So in terms of putting it together, it doesn't take a ton of time like some other grants do. And you can get individual donations to different classroom projects, which is really awesome. The USDA Farm to School, I was fortunate to talk to one of the agency's employees that helps run this grant and get a little bit more information about that. So I'd be happy to chat more later about that. But one thing that's really unique about this grant is there's 3 different grants within it that follow different stages of where you're at in the process. So 2 of those really apply to schools. The third one, which are training grants, are more focused on organizations and agencies. But the implementation grant helps schools to scale or further develop initiatives, whereas the planning grants are if you haven't really done much yet and you're just getting started, they give you funding to start mapping it out and design it. So it's a really strategic way to go into it with a good solid plan before you start implementing it. And so you could apply 1 year for the planning grant, and then if you get it, apply for the implementation grant the next year. So that's a good resource, but I'd keep an eye out in the fall for the next round of grants for that. The Whole Kids Foundation is just one of many different corporate foundations that I've listed here and that are available. It's created in partnership with Food Corps, and that is, I believe, $2,000 for the grant to support a new or existing edible garden at your school. The Whole Kids Foundation also does have a bee cause project that helps provide an educational honeybee hive to the school as well. It's a separate part of it, but that's another great way to have this conversation with your students and be working through that. Another thing I really liked about the Whole Kids Foundation was that they have a resource center, curriculum, and tips on even writing the grant all on their site. So that's really helpful if this is the first time you're writing a grant like this, to go through some of that and just even checking out their site. The Foundation Center, this is an online directory. It does cost money to join it, but a lot of times your local library will have access to it and let you go on through the library. So I would look into that. It's a really great resource to scope out what different grants are available near you, and nationally as well. But it has a lot of additional resources that you won't necessarily find just Googling. And the thing to keep in mind with that is a lot of times grants that are maybe under the category nutrition will still apply to starting your own school garden. So kind of keeping it broad there. And then matching funds is just another thing that I thought I'd mention to consider. We're going to local companies and seeing if you're able to raise X amount of money through your student body and different initiatives, would they match that and help with your initiatives? So that's something that is pretty common and you could find some success with. So switching gears a bit to NGSS, I know this is a big topic in terms of starting projects like this and wanting them to meet the standards. So again, kind of citing this City Sprouts program out of Cambridge. You can see here on the left-hand side, they list some of the STEM practices, and these are all things that they're thinking about while they're working with the students in the garden. So asking questions and developing and using different models, planning and carrying out investigations, and analyzing and interpreting data. So these are some of the things they're thinking about. They bring the students out in the garden and they have them use their different senses to smell and taste and touch and guess what the herb is or what the plant is. Asking different questions about when things are blooming and all those different things. And then you can see another example on the right is doing taste testing of different spices and then sort of recording my reaction to them. So where I felt it, what I felt, how would I rate it? So this is geared towards more of an middle school level, but starting those conversations about what you have and what's your reaction and different things along those lines. And if you go to their website, the City Sprouts website, they have specific curriculums as well that they've developed. And so you can scope out different grade levels and see if any fit your needs. So cultural and environmental awareness. This was a great image from a webinar I was on recently through the NAEE that I wanted to share with you all because it's talking about how do you take this topic and think about it both culturally and environmentally. So there's a different organization here in Cambridge, Mass, that what they did recently was they have a very diverse community. So they worked with their different student body on some of the main places they were from internationally and what the local plants were there and the local vegetables. They figured out what they could grow in the Northeast because, of course, our climate's quite different from some of the locations they chose. And then they ended up growing some of that produce in Cambridge. And then they had conversations about, for example, one of the regions was Haiti. They were growing some plants from Haiti here. And then having conversations about, well, what do you do with that vegetable? Well, that looks good. I've never seen that before. How do I even cook that? And having those conversations, learning new recipes and dishes, and in exchange, just sharing more about the different cultures that are in the area. So there's lots of creative ways that this can go cross-disciplinary and have those experiences as well. So as Teach Earth alumni are from all across the U.S. I really wanted to highlight that this isn't just happening in certain areas. Here are just a few examples where we do have quite a few Teach Earth alumni, Vermont, New York City, North Carolina, and California, that through the USDA website, I found some really great examples of what certain schools or nonprofits are doing that I wanted to share tonight. So one of those examples is in New York City Public Schools. There's a Garden to Cafe program. And so it partners with nonprofits and community members to allow students to work in the gardens and learn about the source of their food. And they actually produce quite a bit of food that is then distributed around New York City Public Schools. Another example up in Milton, Vermont are these 3 indoor tower gardens where they grow tons of herbs, and their food service director got a grant to build these so that the students going through the dining hall can see all these herbs that are then going into their food. And of course, in Vermont, having that indoors is really key based on our Northeast weather. Another example out in Berkeley, California is Martin Luther King Middle School. They have an edible schoolyard. So they teach all their science standards through this edible schoolyard and get the kids out there most days. And so that's another way to do it out there. In North Carolina, there's a nonprofit called Growing Minds. So they develop different lesson plans based on North Carolina's state standards for science that they then distribute to the different schools using gardens as the core of the lesson. So if you're in North Carolina, definitely check out Growing Minds. So I'll let Kristin jump on as well here in a moment, and we'll take any questions. But before we get there, we are very excited to briefly announce our National School Garden Project starting in fall 2018. So this project will be a comparison of different observations and data virtually for any teachers that are interested in participating. The minimum would be starting to grow some herbs in your classroom and being part of this network where we're sharing and swapping ideas and talking about what's working and what's not, and acting as a support to start some initiative with gardens in your classroom and using it as part of science lessons. So we'll be getting back to you with some more details on that in the coming months. But if you are interested in being part of this network within Teach Earth and Project Kindle alumni who are interested in the sharing of ideas as you're developing different garden plans at your school, just send a note to that email by June 11th. If you do have more questions, you're also welcome to reach out to us about it. So with that, I'll leave it if anyone has any questions for either of us. Okay, well, if there are, oh, there's a question. Kristin, what is your students' reaction to working in the garden?
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's very positive. The students love to get outside and do activities, of course, and I'm sure you're all aware of that when you take your students outside. They love going outside. Um, Different reactions I've had from parents, have been that, they're really excited that the children are learning where their food comes from, because even though our school is a really rural school, a lot of the students don't seem to make that connection between where the food comes from, that they're actually eating from the grocery store. I think to some of the younger students, especially, the grocery store is this place where the food comes from. And it's really interesting that through doing these garden projects, that the students then develop this awareness that food actually comes from farmers, which is really interesting, since we are a rural school district. You would think they know that already, but a lot of the time they don't. There's kind of a disconnect. Student reactions. I mean, I've been teaching 19 years now, and I still have students, even from my beginning years of teaching, that come back to me, and the things that they mention are not, not the worksheets we did or the activities we did inside, but probably about 75% of the time when older kids mention to me stuff they remember, it's stuff we did outside, whether it be in the garden or out in our field or river or forest, or something after school at science club. They usually mention something outside, and I think those things kind of stick with them, all these interesting projects they've done, and connecting their senses with sense of smell and sense of taste, going along with all of the learning we're doing. I think that really helps just cement it into their brain, and hopefully into their life as they grow up, and they maybe remember that pesto they ate, and maybe they'll grow some basil on their own at their own homes as they grow older.
Any other questions for us tonight? All right, then I think we'll wrap up for tonight. As I said, we'll be sending some of those handouts that were mentioned out over email. If you are interested in participating this fall in the National Garden Project, then just email fellowshipawards@earthwatch.org. And feel free to follow up with either of us if you have any questions that come to mind as you're thinking more about this. And if any of the things from the presentation you want to go back through, we'll be posting it on YouTube later this week as well. Thanks so much for joining, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for coming.